Welcome to the second part of our program this morning. This is where we zero in on housing. And there's a lot going on in the urban environment today. We have COVID-19, we have demonstrations, some rioting, worries about gentrification, affordability of housing. It all seems to be in flux. And we have three speakers today who are going to help us make some sense out of where the urban environment is going and what that means for housing in the US and California. And we're going to start with the big picture on the urban environment with this first conversation, and then move on to housing, and next to our final conversation of the morning, which will focus on affordability in California. So our first guest comes to us from the University of Toronto. Professor Richard Florida is an American urban studies theorist focusing on social and economic theory. He is a professor and head of the Martin Prosperity Institute at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto and a distinguished fellow at NYU's School of Professional Studies. He received his PhD from Columbia University, and prior to his current appointments, taught at George Mason University and at Carnegie Mellon University, and he is senior editor at The Atlantic. Welcome to UCLA, Richard.
It's great to be with you. I only wish I could be with you in person, but hopefully in the not too distant future.
Right. So maybe in a coming conference.
I hope so. I would love to be with you.
Yeah, that would be great. Let's start by just talking about the landscape going into the COVID-19 pandemic and kind of where that takes us. You know, in your book about the creative class, you described this as being the driving force for urban growth and vitality, which seems to really have been prescient as coastal cities and tech-centric cities were the winners in the last decade. Can you just lead us into our discussion by describing why that works, and importantly, why a lack of this component in the urban environment is an impediment to urban success? And, you know, in thinking about this, there was an article just today in SF Gate from San Francisco about wealthy tech San Franciscans out buying property in Marin and Sonoma and Napa and even, you know, as far afield as up at Lake Tahoe, to socially distant from the dense urban environment. So, you know, is there something that is really changing this notion as we go into the rest of the 21st century?
So I think the short answer is, you know, every crisis like this brings out a raft of dystopian takes and another round of this is the end of cities. New York's obituary was written in 2001. At a time when I wrote the book you mentioned, was right finishing the book, The Rise of the Creative Class, and people said, don't publish it, you'll be proven wrong. Everyone's going to leave cities and go back to the suburbs. At a point when they were just beginning to start to come back to cities. This obituary was again written not only from New York, but for San Francisco, for Los Angeles, for London, in the wake of the 2008 economic and financial crisis. Again, wrong. In fact, we saw the biggest wave of urban revitalization following that economic crisis. And in fact, if you asked me what I got wrong, and probably I got a lot wrong, the thing I got most wrong is that I completely underpredicted the veracity and ferocity of the urban revival that would occur over the past 2 decades. So all that said, I don't think this is the end of cities. We're through this pandemic and its fallout. You know, it's not just a pandemic. There's the economic fallout from the lockdown. There's the fiscal fallout that affects cities. And then, of course, compounding that, the kind of social unrest and civic unrest that comes not just from the pandemic, but from police brutality, right? Which is always been a big factor, the propagating factor, catalyzing factor in periods of American civil and social unrest. You know, but I was able to actually go back and look at the history of pandemic disease throughout all of human history. By the way, you know, I've been a student now of urbanism for 3 or 4 decades. And not once had I encountered the effects of pandemic disease or pestilence or infectious disease on cities. And not as an undergraduate student in urban affairs, not as a graduate student in city and regional planning, and not as a professor. Moreover, and this is really interesting to me, I realized in studying the history of pandemics and their effect on cities that I was born in the middle of a pandemic in 1957. My parents never mentioned it. That pandemic killed 100,000 Americans, and it also killed infants and children. And in addition to that, my parents, both of whom were born in the early 1920s, were among the youngest of their respective families, which means that all of my aunts and uncles were either born during the Spanish flu or children. No one mentioned it. So what I've come to conclude through a lot of research, including some of it done with a UCLA professor, a professor named Michael Storper, he and a professor at LSD, Andres Rodriguez-Poz, and I are writing a big piece on this about pandemics and urbanization, is that pandemics have not really altered the course of urbanization. That this force of gravity, if you will, this gravitational force of clustering, of agglomeration, of people locating around one another in dense and clustered urban environments, how that spurs innovation, how that spurs productivity is a much stronger force than infectious disease, even before we had advanced medical technology or antiviral drugs or potential vaccines or antibiotics that deal with the secondary byproducts of these infections. So our cities will be fine. Here's what I think the way to look at this is. I think there'll be a set of pull forces that will pull some people out. You mentioned the movement of some people out of San Francisco to Marin or Sonoma or Napa counties or Tahoe. There's been innumerable stories of people leaving Manhattan for the Hamptons, for Hudson, for the Hudson Valley, for Miami. My calculation is that 1.6% of New Yorkers actually forwarded a mail forwarding address form, New York Times data, which they made a big deal at, 1.6, and less than 0.5% left the New York Metro. So that's telling you how big this is. But I think if you have a family, if you have young kids, if you're an older person, if you're vulnerable, if you're one of these pied-à-terre owners, who dabbled in a city and may come from a foreign country and air travel is restricted, I think those folks will leave. If you have a bunch of kids and you can work remotely, and you say, I want to put my kids in a place where school's closer by and they can walk. Yeah, those are the kind of people who, and you're more vulnerable. Those are the folks who will leave cities. And we'll see some of that, and we have seen some of that. But I think, and you mentioned my book on the creative class, I think, cities like San Francisco, and you're gonna have Connor talking about this, have become horrendously, stupendously unaffordable. Los Angeles too, New York. I mean, you got to a point where these were luxury cities that only, not the creative class. The creative class was getting forced out along with low-income people in the middle class. The only people who could afford to live there, the only people I knew buying apartments in Lower Manhattan were 60-plus-year-old rich people. And so cities were becoming luxury cities that many blocks of London and New York and San Francisco were darkened and filled with people who looked at cities as a part of an investment-grade asset, not as a place to live. So I think the opportunity will be that actually cities can reset themselves. And there'll be an opportunity, if commercial space and offices become less attractive for a whole variety of reasons, not just remote work. That was already happening. If retail continues to decline, and if housing becomes less demanded by rich people and pied-à-terre owners and foreign investors, we'll get a moment. And I think it'll be a short moment. And let me say that I said this in 2008. I said, San Francisco and New York and Los Angeles would have a moment that they could reset their economies and actually double down on being diverse and more inclusive and better cities. We have the opportunity to rebuild our cities better. We can either take that moment now, or if not, my fear is we'll forget about this pandemic. Like the 1918 pandemic was followed by the Roaring '20s. It is called in the historical literature the forgotten pandemic. We quickly forgot about it and had a giant free-for-all party. It took another 2 decades for us to build the social compact that built the middle class. So my real fear is that we'll forget about this and our cities, if anything, will go back to the old trajectory, once again become attractive and become more unequal. So I think it's incumbent upon us to take this opportunity now to build our cities more inclusive, more diverse, more resilient, and better.
So let's talk for a minute about one of the driving, so we economists don't talk about this too much, but one of the driving forces of urbanization and of the creative class, as you call them, coming to cities, and that's the marriage market. So the dynamic, creative folks tend to be young. And Carboni and Kahn wrote about the marriage market, and Glaser talked about it in The Triumph of the City, that if you are living out in Bend or some far-flung place, so that you're not in the dense urban city, your chances of meeting a mate are much lower. At least that you get a wider selection in a dense city. Is that still going to be, kind of in the age of the internet, an important aspect driving young creative people into dense cities?
So I do think the US is kind of a special case in some regards. I think Toronto will have very little effect at all. I mean, this will not affect the trajectory of Toronto very much at all, aside from the fiscal fallout, which will affect every city. I think the US is a special case because our cities will get even younger. Our cities have always skewed young, and the reason is our cities have never been really great places for families. If you have a couple of kids, 3, 4 kids, just dealing with schools in an American urban center, this if you live in Los Angeles, finding a school, driving your kids to school is a nightmare. Compared to in Toronto, I have little kids. My kids have 4 or 5 neighborhood schools that they could walk to. So I think in the US, I think you're 100% right. Matt Kahn's a dear friend, Ed Glaser's a dear friend. They're 100% right that our cities are not only about a thick labor market, and that labor market is particularly important for young people who have to establish a career. And if you've established a career, then you can go remote. But young people have to develop those personal networks. I've had almost everyone I've talked to in the financial markets and in the high-tech sector say the same thing. You only get jobs based on personal connections and the depth and strength of your personal network. So young people are going to come to cities, but moreover, as you said, young people are going to come to cities because there are just more young people there. Their friends from college go there, and they're thinking ahead. I wanted some people to date. I want a bunch of other interesting young people. I want to be part of. Now they don't call it this. We call it this, a mating market. So I think our cities, on balance, are going to get younger than they've been because I think families are going to leave. And thinking about this from an urban economics point of view, in Glaser terms or in Matt Kahn terms, cities really provide 2 kinds of functions that Ed Glaser has clearly pointed out to more than anyone else. The first function is the function cities have always provided, which let's call their productivity function. People settled in cities, and cities became the greatest kind of invention of human civilization because they made us more productive and innovative. This was Jane Jacobs' fundamental insight. This is what Robert Lucas said was the basic mechanism of economic development. He called it a human capital externality or a Jane Jacobs externality. When we cluster together in cities, it makes all of us more productive. It amplifies us. But cities also have an amenity value. And now LA becomes a perfect example of this. California cities with wonderful climate, wonderful beaches, and San Francisco with wonderful urban amenities become prized not only for their productivity value, but for their amenity value. And a young man named David Alboui, an urban economist, actually calculated this and showed when you look at his list, it is like California cities, when you look at the co-joint urban amenity and urban productivity value. I think that what the pandemic will do is very much lessen the urban amenity value so that people who are coming to cities because they could be near opera and ballet and great restaurants, some of that stuff in the long term, it'll come back. But in short term, simply won't be accessible. There'll be lots of failures in the restaurant industry. Museums will close. Big performance halls will be shuttered or socially distanced. It will reset cities to increase their productivity value. That's not a bad thing. Some critics have said cities have become too much luxury cities, have become too highly prized for their amenity value. That's kind of what Connor Dougherty is arguing a little bit in his book. Because we don't have enough housing supply, people are consuming cities for the amenity and luxury value, pricing out the highly productive middle-class people, even creatives, artistic and cultural and musical creatives, middle-class people, service providers. So I think cities will be valued for their mating market. They'll become younger, and there's a potential to tilt the balance away from the amenity value of city in the short run towards the productivity value, and that'll be a good thing.
Right, so I have a chart that I show with some frequency, and it is a partial correlation chart that shows the relationship between those amenities and affordability. and it's actually a fairly tight relationship that, and so I think what you're saying is that that the older people who are in cities now will want to socially distant and move out, and that'll provide that reset for younger people to move in. Uh, from a planning point of view, though, so Joel Kotkin has argued that that planners ought to be planning for more urban sprawl, more suburbs. On the other hand, cities really need to stay vital and want to stay vital. From a planning point of view, is there anything different about the post-pandemic environment that cities ought to be thinking about and that we ought to be thinking about in terms of how those economies evolve?
It's interesting that Joel, who is a Southern Californian, and I have become very good friends, even though we were vicious debating partners. And I find that I learn a ton from Joel, even when I disagree, and we disagree a lot. But actually, we've been comparing notes a lot about this. And I think though our emphases are different, we have certain points of commonality about building better cities, and Joel's point about building more vibrant suburbs. Look, I think from a planning point of view, the big changes in cities that occur that I've always been aware of, but not nearly aware of enough, and not nearly aware of where they come from. The big changes in cities that are a result of infectious disease and health crises, whether that was the cholera epidemic or the earlier bouts of infectious disease, tuberculosis and others, that affected US cities in the late 19th and early 20th century that my own parents told me a lot about. My parents all struggled with childhood diseases. Those changed the built environment of cities, what we call planning, and in very interesting ways. We started to build parks and open spaces, or to expand parks and open spaces, in part to build a healthier city and a city that was safer for disease. We upgraded our infrastructure, our water and sewer systems. We began to put in public drinking fountains. We began to widen our streets. And of course, advances in building technology, like building codes that said we needed more light and ventilation in places like New York. The movement about modern buildings, modernism with steel and concrete technology to replace wood. The emphasis on building sanitary bathrooms, powder rooms. This all is a result of cities grappling with infectious disease. So my hunch is the big change in cities won't be the public health change. And maybe Americans will wear masks. That would be a good thing if we became a little bit more like people in Asian cities, that when there's a flu outbreak, we put a mask on. But I think we will begin to think about how to build healthier and safer cities. For example, one lasting change. And look, I talked about dystopian takes. I think there's been also this raft of utopian takes. We will pedestrianize entire cities. Our cities will become cities lined with sidewalk cafes. We'll have bike lanes everywhere. Parks will be expanded, and we'll have an urban nirvana, some combination of Copenhagen and Amsterdam and Paris. But I do think bike lanes will be one lasting change. I think that people will realize that riding a bike is a pretty efficient way to get around a city. I think that we will see a more emphasis on parks and parklets. It might not be giant parks. We will see some expansion of sidewalks. Jane Jacobs always advocated for wider sidewalks, where you can dine a little bit more al fresco. But cities will look more or less the same as they do now. We're not going to see these massive changes in our built form. But I do think health and safety will enter into the planning discourse in a way that hasn't been the case for my entire career. And I think this idea of resilience, people talk about resilience and sustainability with regard to climate change, a big and important problem. I think when we talk about resilience and sustainability now, we're going to talk about just basic health and safety as well as climate change. So yeah, I think the intersection of kind of urbanism, better managed cities, and public health, and also the whole outgrowth of the Black Lives Matter and the current moment of social unrest, that will bring the issues of diversity and inclusion more on the table. And look, I need to say this. I was forged as an urbanist by the riots and civil unrest of 1967 and 1968. I witnessed that in my hometown of Newark, New Jersey, as a young boy. My dad and I were actually driving through Newark. My dad was pulled over. We heard shots fired. We saw tanks and National Guardsmen. And that kind of was the thing that really catalyzed, if you will, my interest in urbanism. In the 1960s, cities were already on the decline. Capital was flowing out. There was incredible disinvestment. People were fleeing to the suburbs. And the movement was largely a movement that was really taking place in minority neighborhoods. Today's wave of unrest is very different. Cities are on the upswing. Investment has been pouring into cities. Talent and capital have been moving back to cities. And in fact, what this moment of civil disobedience is about a much more multicultural, multiracial movement. So my hunch is that this augurs in something very different, that in fact, what we're likely to get is not a wave of disinvestment and abandonment, but actually a political movement, quite interestingly, multicultural, multi-class, multiracial, that combined with this emphasis on health and safety and better policing, reformed policing, community engagement, could actually help us build more resilient, more sustainable, more diverse, and more inclusive cities. It could help us point the arrow in a future of better cities. Now, look, we're going to have to do that seriously. We're going to have to be intentional about it. We're going to need support from a new federal government, hopefully in November. But there is a possibility out of this, very different from the late 1960s, that instead of our cities weakening, that this constellation of forces, which looks very threatening to urban America in the short run, may actually come to pass, that they lead us to finally build a set of stronger, healthier, more vibrant and inclusive cities. And you know, that's my hope. My hope is that's where we head.
So let's explore that a little bit more. And you brought up Jane Jacobs, and in the Death of American Cities, Death and Rise of American Cities.
Death and Life.
Death and Life of American Cities. She talked about a neighborhood in North Boston, I believe it was, a very poor neighborhood, but it was very vital and vibrant, and she sort of celebrated everything that was happening there. But one of the real concerns about the kind of development of young people coming in, of cities becoming wealthier because there's a lot of economic activity, people wanting to live closer to work, is that we have gentrification, and we have the further marginalization of communities that are already marginalized. In Los Angeles, we have the Crenshaw Subway Coalition, which is a strange name for the organization because the organization is dedicated to, and I think I quote correctly, preserving the last all-Black neighborhood in Los Angeles. It's in South Los Angeles. So, with the urban unrest we're seeing now, a lot of this is about the marginalized communities. Yes, it's about police brutality, but it's also about a lack of services and about being ignored as cities grow and prosper. How does all of this fit in, particularly if we move to more of Joel Kotkin's vibrant suburbs?
Well, this is something that has concerned me for much of my career. And in fact, the most recent book I wrote just a couple of years ago was called The New Urban Crisis. And it said the combination of housing unaffordability, rampant inequality in cities, rising, and extreme racial and economic segregation, not only between city and suburb, but between neighborhoods in cities and suburbs. And out of control, runaway gentrification was causing our cities to face a fundamental crisis. And in fact, I argued in that book that this new urban crisis, which was a crisis largely of cities' comeback and success, very different than the old urban crisis of urban dysfunction and decay and disinvestment, was not only the fundamental crisis of cities, but in fact, the fundamental crisis of late capitalism. I said that quite clearly in the book. And if we didn't come to grips with it, it would challenge our system as a whole. And in fact, that's what these civil movements, civil unrest, civil disobedience, protest movements are saying. And it's not just a coalition of racial minorities, it's a multiracial coalition. And it's not just in the US, it's worldwide. We're seeing the same kind of protest in Toronto, in London, in Berlin, in Paris. So look, it's a wake-up call. And I've been urging city leaders, and remember, most of the leadership of these cities is progressive. People like Bill de Blasio, who made the case of a tale of two cities. The leadership of these great cities in the United States is almost all in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, yet they are, because of these structural forces that have brought capital and affluent people and educated people back to cities, and because we don't have enough great neighborhoods, led to increased housing prices and gaping inequality. So look, this is something that is very different than what Jane Jacobs was arguing about. You know, Jane was dealing with a movement out of cities, no gentrification, very little gentrification, and the heavy hand of government urban planning that was destroying great neighborhoods. In fact, you mentioned the North End in Boston. My dad grew up in a neighborhood in Newark that was just like that, and his boyhood home was knocked down to make room for a freeway, the kind of thing Jane Jacobs and others successfully protested against in the New York City's Greenwich Village. Gentrification is a much more nefarious force. Market forces are a much more nefarious force. So look, we have to build more housing. And it'll be interesting to hear what Connor has to say about this. Not only do we have to build more housing, we have to build more affordable housing. It's not just enough to build more expensive housing, because that just attracts more rich people to cities. We have to double down and build more affordable housing. As I argue in the New Urban Crisis, it's not enough just to act on the housing supply side. We have to act on the demand side. We now have about 50% of our workforce in the country and in cities, Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, composed of low-wage service workers, our frontline heroes. People in retail, grocery work, emergency service work, personal services, old age services, childcare services, we can go on. They're largely minority, they're largely immigrant, they're largely female-headed households, and they make a pittance. Precarious jobs, contingent work. We have to radically increase their wages. And look, we did it in the New Deal. My dad always told me a story. My dad started work at age 13 in a factory in Newark, New Jersey in the 1930s during the Depression to help support his family. It took him and 7 other family members, actually 8 other family members, to make a family wage. So 9 people total. When he came back from his service in World War II, where he stormed the beaches of Normandy, fought in all the great battles in World War II, he had the same job in the same factory, but it paid him a living wage, a middle-class wage. He could get married, have myself, his 2 kids, his 2 boys, and put us through Catholic school and through State University, Rutgers College in New Jersey. We decided as a society we'd pay more for cars and durable goods and eyeglasses and other manufacturing goods to create a working class. We have to do the same with the service class today. We simply have to create a middle class out of those frontline workers. And we're seeing a movement, seeing a movement to demand that. Look, what I think is different now, and you mentioned vibrant suburbs, what gives me some optimism, not Pollyannish, but some optimism, is if our society was completely divided between the wealthy and the educated in suburbs and the poor in cities, I would say that it would be very difficult to build a political movement to positively change our cities and our society to become more diverse and inclusive. We would be balkanized. The fact of the matter is that cities have become more attractive, and in attracting more industry, more investment, more middle-class people, more affluent people, they have become more diverse. But they also have large minority populations, large immigrant populations, large low-income populations, still working-class populations, all of which register and are registering in their politics. So actually, our revitalized cities are a much more fertile area for political contestation in a progressive direction than a society split between wealthy suburbs and poor cities. So yeah, I think that this conflict is going to register itself in cities. And my hope is, as it registers itself in our great cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, Boston, Seattle, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, I could go on, Detroit, Cleveland, it then bubbles up and informs a more robust national politics that can begin. And I think that's what's happening. So is this all going to happen overnight? No. But is the arrow pointing in a better direction? Yeah, I think it is.
So in the post-COVID-19, post-recession era, you're seeing cities actually move to build a lot more housing? Is that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think cities are going to be fiscally strapped for a while. I think that there will be a glut of commercial office space that either is going to have to be reused or repurposed. If you talk to people about Lower Manhattan after 9/11, they'll tell you the best thing they did was repurpose commercial office space into residential housing. I think there's going to be retail space. There's going to be a glut of retail space, and maybe that can be repurposed. Some as housing, some as already studio space. And I think in most cities, Los Angeles and New York, there's been a glut of high-end housing that's not going to sell. So I'm not sure we're going to see a wave of new construction, but I think we're going to see cities become more affordable, and people have to get creative about how they're going to reuse office buildings and retail space and what was built to be high-end luxury housing for rich foreigners. So I think it's going to take some of the pressure off. I think thinking about how to repurpose that and to add housing for less advantaged people, how to support affordable housing and workforce housing, how to boost the wages of service workers, those are all going to register on the agenda. But no, and I think we're going to have a period. Now, I don't know how long that's going to be. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think we're going to have an inventory, a supply of real estate assets that can be repurposed towards more affordable housing for a while. And in many ways, Connor would be better to talk about this than me. But what people have been talking about, YIMBY, moving away from no, not in my backyard, to yes, build it in my backyard. Maybe we're going to have enough housing and real estate potential assets that without building a lot of new stuff immediately, we can start to repurpose and adaptively reuse stuff to provide more affordable housing. But I just want to add this proviso. Every time I have said this before, and I've said that our cities will come back and let's take advantage of this moment, people have looked at me and said, no, you're wrong. Cities are down and out. They won't come back. There will be a shift out of cities into suburbs. Cities will be down on their luck for quite a while, especially big cities. And in every case, I took that criticism and underpredicted. And I blame myself. I said, it will happen. There will be a reset, but it won't be as vigorous. I was shocked by how fast our cities came back during the 2000s and 2010s. And it wouldn't surprise me, given all of these forces leading to finance and high tech, and even with remote work, that if our cities once again overcame these odds and came back in a pretty significant way, now, not next month, not in the next 6 months, maybe not in the next year, but over 2 or 3 or 4 year period, if they come back quite significantly. Look, I think the effect of pandemics are not to really disrupt our societies. And in fact, their effects tend to be less than economic crises. They tend to accelerate changes already underway. So I think those changes will be young people to cities, families to suburbs, some more remote work, but certainly a lot of office work in cities, especially for young people. And hopefully our cities resetting a bit so that they can be more creative and innovative places and less places that are just about consuming amenities and luxury goods. And we'll see. I mean, time will play this out. And I do think, I want to say this. The US is kind of a special case. The US is one of the very few places in the world where it is much, much harder to raise a family in cities. It is not nearly as hard to raise a family or have kids in a city like Toronto, where you have provincially funded schools and publicly provided healthcare and big, big universities like the one I teach in that have 95,000 students, so that it's much easier for families to navigate that landscape. This barbell demography of the US, where you have very young people and kind of empty nesters in cities and families move out to the suburbs, is quite unique. And that pattern may be reinforced for the next 3, 4, 5 years.
So that's interesting. So in Sacramento, there's actually a bill to provide incentives and subsidies for the repurposing of retail space into affordable housing. So that goes along with what you were saying, but also your prediction that we're going to have a capital loss in a lot of high-end residential in California cities is an interesting prediction.
The one thing that I would say that worries me as an urbanist is what I see as real fear of trains and transit. And that doesn't help when our own CDC issues a guideline that basically says, and when you reopen your office, tell people to drive themselves alone to work. That doesn't help the case. And so one of the things that worries me, especially in cities like New York and Toronto and Chicago, that are very heavily dependent upon transit to get people to and from work, is the increase in car congestion. I mean, I think that if people stay afraid of trains and transit, that will be a big issue. And so that also worries me with transit-oriented development, which is another thing that's been a bill in Sacramento. That I think some of these transit-oriented suburbs that people were very high on, that real estate developers were very high on, where you could get out of your house and jump on a train or transit to work, they're going to be challenged for a while. Now, I think that will abate in another year or 2 years. That worries me. One thing that I would say that I think is very interesting from your perspective in Southern California, I think that Southern California is likely to be relatively advantaged by this shift. And one of the things that I noticed in studying the 1918 Spanish flu, the New York metropolitan area did add 2 million people, and it was the largest metropolitan area in 1910. It remained the largest by quite a bit in 1930. There was one metropolitan area that surged up the rankings between 1910 and 1930, and it's called Greater Los Angeles. That I think one thing that you might see as a result of this pandemic, if people desire at the margin families, single family living, a car, that you might see people who otherwise might have preferred East Coast living, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C., say, you know, there's this place called Los Angeles, which is a great urban environment, which is sunny and warm, and we believe, whether rightly or wrongly, we believe that mitigates the virus, that wasn't as hard hit as New York or Washington, D.C., or the suburbs of New York by the original round of the coronavirus or COVID-19, where I can have a car, even though its traffic is daunting. I wouldn't be surprised at the margin if one of the places that gets a little bit of so this is, I say, gird yourself for this, that gets a little bit of a boost from this pandemic is Greater Los Angeles and Southern California writ large. It wouldn't shock me. And by the way, you know, I was able to look at the data before this pandemic and not only chart the migration of jobs and skills, but if you look at the movement of artists and creatives, and the census did a special run on this, and I wrote about it at City Lab. One of the places New York-based artistic creatives have been moving is Los Angeles and Southern California. So that's not to say that this is a disruption. It's to say that that's already a trend that's been in place, that New Yorkers, and particularly artistic creators from New York, gets kind of woken up to what's ever going on in Southern California. So at the margin, it wouldn't surprise me that if Los Angeles capitalizes, not that New York's going to decline and fall, but if Los Angeles actually gets a little bit bigger of a boost from this pandemic than most people believe.
Well, that's an interesting and high note to bring our conversation to a conclusion. So I want to really thank you very much for taking the time, for joining us here at UCLA, albeit via Zoom, and for sharing your insights. So thank you for listening, and we will move on to our next conversation, and that will be with David Schulman and Ivy Zellman on the state of the housing industry.
Thank you. It's been a delight being with you.